Welcome to Across the Arc, where we dive into the extraordinary work of Equiarc members that are leveling the playing field in classical music. This episode features intergenerational perspectives from the Oberlin Conservatory. We have Chris Jenkins, the Associate Dean for Academic Support and a musicology professor, and Solomon Leonard, who is a junior viola performance major. This conversation is centered around Chris's newly released book, Assimilation versus Integration in Music Education, which speaks to what is truly needed for students of color to express their full identities on campus.
Chris and Solomon, could you share about your musical upbringing? I want to hear about the music you grew up listening to and how you started playing your instrument.
My musical experiences ranged since I was a baby, pretty much. When I first began learning an instrument, I started on the recorder, I think, and also singing in the choir at my school. I did sing a little bit despite my ability now. And I started playing the viola, though, when I was in middle school, when I was 11 years old. So you can call me a late bloomer, quote unquote, through my middle school program. And that's where I truly gained the love for the instrument and that goosebumps feeling of what music can do to somebody and how it can inspire somebody. And as I went on to high school, to the Los Angeles County High School for the Arts, LOXA, through joining the ICOLA program, and halfway through my high school experience, I got into my jazz programs. I really got a sense of the musical industry, and especially being in Los Angeles, it was very significant for opportunities for me and people to know and music to learn, and it was amazing. And upon many schools, I decided that Oberlin Conservatory was the best option for me, with mentors like Chris Jenkins and many of the teachers here and faculty here and guest artists that they bring. And I felt that it was the best environment for me, and it definitely was. I've learned so much, and I could see myself going to grad school and on from there.
So for me, it's funny, I was thinking about that sensation that Solomon was referencing when you get goosebumps from music, and I was trying to look it up. There's actually a technical term for it, but not everyone gets that. I think people who are really more sensitive to music and more attuned to becoming musicians tend to get that. So it's significant, I think, that Solomon was recognizing that even when you were young. For me, my parents played and still play a lot of classical music in the house. I was really raised on that. And also coming from New York in the 90s and 80s, I listened to a lot of 90s hip hop. Probably those two things were my two main sources of music, in middle school, high school, and then college also. I started getting into jazz and listening to quote unquote everything. I mean, nobody listens to everything, but there are a lot of us who listen to many things. So I was definitely one of those folks, but it was not like all that music was in the house from my parents. I had to play a lot of it myself. They were playing a lot of Bach and Brahms and, the classical radio station in New York, WQXR, that was on all the time.
Nice. And so, Chris, when did you start playing viola?
I started violin when I was
Oh.
7. And then I switched to viola when I was in middle school, when I got taller. But I had, a pretty standard training for a conservatory student. I did ear training and theory and all these things and chamber music and orchestra all through, my teens. And so I got to college pretty ready for a conservatory experience. I didn't go to a conservatory for college. I went to Harvard, and then I went to NEC for grad school. But the environment at Harvard, even though it wasn't strictly a conservatory, there were a lot of really amazing musicians there and a really high level of playing. So it was similar, in many ways.
Solomon, you told us up till Oberlin, so that's where you are now as a student. But for Chris, your experience has gone past that. So could you talk about what that journey since conservatory up till now has looked like for you?
So I finished Harvard with a degree in music theory and went to NEC for grad school, got a master's there, got a professional certificate at MSM the year after that. And then I freelanced in New York for a long time, for at least a decade. And at that point, there was, I know for me, something missing, and that I wanted some other experiences besides just playing music. So I actually got a master's degree in international affairs and then lived overseas in the Middle East for a little while. And then I was actually asked to apply for this job at Oberlin as an assistant dean about 10 years ago. And I moved to Ohio.
And remind me, where are you originally from?
Oh, I'm from New York City. So
Yeah.
this was a big change. Actually, the Middle East was a lot easier to live in the Palestinian territories and the Levantine area. That was a much easier place to be. Culturally, I would say, I felt much more at home there than here. But you know, I mean, that's sort of the nature of being a black person in this field where most of the spaces are white, especially in education, where so many institutions are in majority white areas and fairly rural areas. You don't have much latitude. I'm frankly, I think, pretty lucky to have ended up in a place like Oberlin and also a town like Cleveland, where there's a majority, if not a majority black population, there's a sizable black population, and I like living there.
What about you, Solomon? You're from big city too, moving to the Midwest. It was the same for me. From San Antonio, went to school in Indiana. So what's that like for you, that transition?
Yeah, being from Los Angeles and moving to Oberlin for the next 4 years, or for I guess currently the next 2 years left.
Mhm.
But it was definitely a change. That was for sure one of the main things I wanted. I wanted to get out of Los Angeles, if anywhere. I wanted to experience the Four Seasons. I wanted to expand my network, of course. And it was more about, even though it was a huge change and I have found ways to navigate it, uh, depending on what time of the year it is. It was definitely more about the people that were there and the type of school that it was that led me to Oberlin. Oberlin is it's a great place to be able to play lots of different styles, and there's so many opportunities for you to expand your range. Even you don't have to make it, your life story, but it's a great there are great experiences for you to expand your horizons. And that's especially something that was a goal of mine before I came to Oberlin, was to be a cross player like that. And definitely now I could say that Oberlin was the right decision for that goal for sure.
Awesome. And since you brought that up, we can get into that conversation about, you are, yeah, like you said, cross-trained in both classical and jazz. So could you talk about how that has impacted your overall perspective as an artist? I'm also curious if you think that more people should receive that sort of cross-training.
Absolutely. I think that I always encourage classical players all the time to step into ensembles. Particularly at Oberlin, we have the Pi Ensemble, Performance and Improvisation, which is specifically made for quote unquote jazz players, quote unquote classical players, to come together and to play world music. And Pi always brings in guest artists for them to truly gain that perspective and to talk to the artists and their experiences, to have like cultural immersion and things like that. And for this ensemble, you don't need any experience at all in improvisation or anything to enter into the ensemble. Like, I joined this ensemble when I was a freshman, I only began improvising in high school. I began my jazz journey in my junior year of high school, but I was still playing arrangements fully written out. But I started improvising when I was in high school, as a senior. I wish I started earlier, and when I got to Oberlin, I was still very fresh off of improvising. But that ensemble was a huge part of my development, and I've gained so much perspective. And on top of that ensemble, I was able to form really great relationships of jazz students in the jazz department. And despite my major mostly being around orchestra and chamber music and things like that, those relationships is the greatest teacher for students who are students under the actual faculty and who have more experience than I do. So I think that it's so valuable to do that. And in addition to go to these places, Oberlin is also a trimester. You have winter term, and you can actually go to these places like Brazil, like West Africa, and like Europe, anywhere, and you could actually go and experience these things in real time. So I always encourage classical students in Oberlin to do these things. and it widens your perspective and it gives you a much more deeper connection to what music really is.
I've been really impressed and amazed by what Solomon has been able to do. It's pretty unusual to do this and really relates to what's possible at Oberlin. I think there are some other schools where it's possible, but not where really someone could be accepted as a true cross genre player, right? We have all these silos that are really strict, and that's partly for reasons of power and control, right? Because once we start diluting those boundaries, honestly, artists, or rather teachers, faculty lose some level of control, right? And that kind of level of strict hierarchy and control is baked in many ways to the conservatory environment, to conservatory structures. So it's pretty unusual to find teachers who are flexible to allow someone to learn a different style, and even to say allow their student to flourish in a different style, not just take part on the side, right?
I will say, like, my class, on top of that, my major here is in classical performance on paper. My student identity here as a classical and jazz player is completely created because of me and my relationships to other students and my effort to be a part of ensembles and to play certain types of songs and repertoire and these things. And it's not that, and also this lifestyle, it doesn't also come with its challenges with trying to manage everything, being a student. And for me, wanting to be a performer, a collaborator, a soloist, it's very, very hard to manage this lifestyle. I would always be very honest with classical players that my lifestyle at Oberlin is, it's always unpredictable. A lot of times during the week is very prone to, all-nighters working on charts and analyzing scores and stuff. I'm always listening to music all the time. And I guess at this point in my junior year, there's certain goals that I have to combine certain themes across all music, which apply in so many different ways, and especially the deeply rooted sense of narrative and how to speak in terms of your playing, and not being conformed to an overall sound, but a sound that still adds to that, but at the same time, you have a true sense of what your sound truly is. And there is no subconscious unawareness of who you are. And I guess I want to take the next step of that. And of course, having conversations with Dean Jenkins is a huge part of that. I know he just released his book and I've taken all of his classes. So he's my guy.
So I'm going to add those. There's something really important here that Solomon's touching on, which has to do with the vision that students have that is much deeper and more effective, usually, than the vision that faculty and administrators will have. So I actually was recalling, Solomon, when you first came into my office, when you were a first year, and you're talking about how you're going to be a jazz student and a classical student. And I remember being like, well, that can't happen. Nobody does that. You can't do that. I don't think I told you just like that, but I was like, yeah, let's see, Solomon. And then you left, and I said to my colleague, well, he can't do that. Nobody does that. And then a year later, I saw, oh, he's doing that. He can do that. I did not have the vision, right? He had the vision, and partly because no one had told him you can't do that. So he had not absorbed that message yet, right? So he was able to do it. If he had just listened to me, he would have been worse off, right? So, and that's something I touch on in the book also, for sure, that most of my opinions about diversity right now in conservatory education are coming from students, and sort of a longer journey that I went on through my conversations with students like Solomon over the past decade that brought me to the place where I am right now. But also, I want to point out for those who suspect that what's happening here is some kind of dilution of the rigor of the classical education. I've been working with a lot of students recently who are mixing genres and doing different kinds of work, academic and musical and what have you. And I'm really struck by the degree of success that they're finding in conventional arenas. Solomon won a competition this summer, right? Playing classical music. So obviously his chops are not suffering. If anything, I think his creativity is probably enhanced, right? And he's probably feeling fresher when he goes back to that music instead of burnt out on the shifts in the first movement of the Bartok concerto for the nth time, right? Because you get burned out on that. But also, I had another student who took also both of my courses, And then they applied to work on a special project over the summer, a mentorship project, a research project on conservatories. And over the course of the summer, their quartet won fish off. They also won an individual competition on violin. And then they produced this amazing presentation and paper about the history of conservatory diversification, right? So I thought, well, these things must be synergistic. It's not as if this other work this student is doing. The student transferred from Juilliard and became a double degree student here, earning a BA and a BM, which would not be possible, right, elsewhere. Obviously, those things are building on themselves to help the student do greater things, not making them less than they would have been. And that's the case for Solomon, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations, Solomon, by the way. I 100% agree. And yes, that was all throughout your book. You're like, this is all additive, this is not subtracting anything from the experience. So yes. And on to the courses that you're talking about that Solomon, you took of Chris's. Chris, your book touched on that as well. You're really calling out institutions to make sure that they're offering a diverse range of classes, dedicating more than just a few sentences to issues related to race and genres that are outside the Western European canon. And then also you mentioned that DEI staff positions, in order for those roles to be effective, that they have to have a say in the curriculum in addition to the support that they offer to individual students. So Chris, since you are both a professor and a DEI staff, I don't know how you do all of that, but could you talk about the process of adding those courses, the racial politics of classical music and hip hop history and analysis, adding it to the curriculum? What did that look like?
Yeah, I was very fortunate to have these ideas at an opportune moment in both in the conservatory's development and just in national history, right? Because after 2020, of course, there are all these efforts nationwide to appear to have some stake in diversification, particularly in reference to Black topics. And I had this idea for this course for a long time, the racial politics of classical music, mostly because of the kinds of articles and books that were coming out. Phil Ewell, the music theorist, wrote his influential article, Music Theory and the White Racial Frame. And then Lauren Kajikawa published a book chapter, The Possessive Investment in Classical Music, which we read in the course, right? And then those were also based on these important works of social theory, right? Joe Fagan, George Lipsitz. So I thought, well, there's too much good stuff here, like good content that students are not really getting to encounter much. So what would it look like if I packaged these writings about music that are more modern and are drawing on these older works of social theory, if I paired them together and taught a course on this, right? And there was also a moment in the leadership of the school where the right people were in the right positions to acquiesce and to support that kind of diversification. So when I brought those courses forward, especially racial politics, there wasn't a lot of pushback. I think people were generally aware and supportive of these new publications. So the idea that students should read them was, if it was controversial, it was not able to, whatever pushback there may have been was not able to generate a lot of traction. That was apparent to me, right? So that course was approved. Also, I had been here for a long time. I'm earning 2 doctorates. So one would hope that I'm qualified to teach this. Also, it's what I do, talk to students of color, right? So I'm talking about that student experience. And then once I had done that, once I had that course in the books and I taught it, it was not so much of a stretch to say, okay, here's this other idea. We should talk about rap music as a musicological topic, right? And not just something that's ethno-musicological or not deserving of serious musical study. And of course, that course is a lot of fun for someone who likes rap music. And the students that I get in both of these courses are really amazing because they're very dedicated and interested in the topics. And from that perspective, I'm extremely lucky, more so I think than pretty much any musicology professor, because I teach two courses that I invented and that I love and that draw extremely invested, talented, bright students. It's pretty rare that you get to do that. So I don't know for how long I'm going to be able to do that, but I'm going to do it while I can.
That's amazing. And Solomon, since you took both of those classes, could you talk about why you chose to take them and how they added to your overall understanding of music?
Yeah, so on top of course, just DJ is coming out with the class. I gotta take the class. On top of that, just excitement. I think it added to my knowledge of politics and make me who I am. Of course, I'm black. I'm a classically based player. Coming up in middle school and coming up in high school in mostly white orchestral scenarios. I guess racial politics, just talking about that first, racial politics helped me to really understand why the things were the way they were, and it helped me to understand that what I was feeling during those times was not out of the ordinary for people like me. When I was in middle school, I acknowledged like that I was the only, if not only, like one of only two or three black people in like a 70-piece orchestra. And especially in a viola section, I was definitely the only player that was black. And I would take that opportunity in lots of ways to showcase that I'm a great player, but at the same time, I didn't truly know what like black music was, and I wasn't able to like connect with it that much in terms of my black identity, because so much of my listening, especially during that time, was my favorite like pop artists like Michael Jackson and such like that. It wasn't necessarily, especially in my middle school days, in terms of my listening classical music per se, or even like movie music or stuff like that. So racial politics of classical music, like what you mentioned before, the white racial frame, and talking about articles, and especially we had an interview with you, right? Yeah, we did. That was a really special moment, and just putting into perspective what our lineage is and talking about current programs and what they're doing and all these things. And for hip hop, I think that I've always been a fan of hip hop for sure. I'm of the new generation, so I've listened to like Drake and all these people. Like Drake and people like him are probably my people that I listen to. Old school Drake, not new school Drake. But anyway, hip hop was such a fun class, and that one opened my eyes because over the course of sophomore year, I also took Intro to African American Music by Courtney Andrews, and a lot of parallels between that class and Dean Jenkins' class, hip hop analysis, definitely interplay, especially when we got to Fight the Power, when we got to Malcolm X and that lineage of people, and the 1960s and all these people. Definitely the duality, when we were talking about that at the same time, that really was opening my eyes to a lot of things, especially when it relates back to even back as far as vaudeville and how black people got into the music industry in the first place. So that one, it really elevated that side of me. So all of these things just elevated more sides of who I am and our lineage as people. And of course, there's other classes that added other parts of that, like literally what happens in Africa and Africanisms that survived and didn't survive, and how those things interplayed. But I think it elevated more of who I am. And of course, now reflecting on those classes and continuing to learn from Dean Jenkins's book and having conversations with him is definitely added more to who I am as a whole, for sure.
Yeah, so we talk about rap music really as a subject for genuine, quote unquote, musical and musicological analysis and study, right? So I think the first class we did like a close listening of some Drake.
Yeah,
right?
we did. We went over the class nonstop.
Yeah.
The song nonstop, and that you were talking about how that song like signified Drake's whole career in a way. How he was like tired. He was like, because I never stop.
Yeah.
I remember you were doing that a lot.
Right. So the idea that things have multiple meanings, right, which is a big part of signification, which is an African survival that you were talking about also in the introduction to African American music course too, right?
Yeah.
I think we actually started off by saying, let's identify every musical element in this song. And it's not, I'm not going to hold this up as hip hop's high watermark Drake's song nonstop. Just that I heard it and I thought, you know what? There's a lot we can talk about here, but it's fairly simple and that people will understand. Like the fact that there's a clock ticking in the background
Yeah.
nonstop, except when he says the word stop. There's a lot actually happening when you try to break it down because people don't regard this music as legitimate. It never gets analyzed or listened to in a really introspective way. We talked about affect, right? What is the affect of the song? How is it created through the musical elements and the rapper's self-presentation, right? How does the rapper build credibility, which is one of the principal elements of rap as a revolutionary art form, right? How do they build revolutionary credibility? All those kinds of things. Really fun. So
Yeah,
much fun
it
to
was
teach that course.
such a great class.
I want to take the class. Were both of these classes able to count towards your degree, Solomon?
Yes, because at the end of my degree, and I've had lots of talks with Dean Jenkins, I'm gonna add on it an African American music minor. Which after this next class of I'm taking the Black Arts Workshop by Miss Caroline Smith, and I believe when I finish that class, I'll have all the requirements to fulfill it. So I'm gonna be definitely adding that on top of my ending major viola performance, and because it needs to be like 2 electives, need to be like 1 full course, and
Yeah, so it's this. We honestly, I came up with this at one moment. We were talking about adding a slew of new minors at Oberlin, right? And it's possible to be earning a BA in the college and have a con minor, or a BM in a con, have a college minor, and there are interdivisional minors, all kinds of combinations that we've made. And I thought it sure would be easy to have an African American music minor because we have a Department of Africana Studies that's very strong. And we have a 2-semester course on African American music that's very strong. Pretty rare to have those things. We could do this. So I proposed it, and the wisdom of it was recognized by many, and we passed it. So students can earn that minor by taking the 2-semester Introduction to African American Music course, Intro to Africana Studies, and then 1 elective in the con, 1 elective in the college. Solomon has far more than is required, I think, now even for the minor. But that's a great way for students to introduce, especially the idea of interdisciplinarity to their studies, which is a really important part of African American expressive culture, also, not siloing off different areas.
Absolutely. That's amazing. Is there anywhere else that even offers that?
Not that I'm aware of. I know that actually I got to present on that at the College Music Society conference last fall, and there were a number of schools that had the capacity to add that kind of course based on their curriculum, and they were interested in doing so. So hopefully some places will do that.
Or trailblazers. That's cool. Okay, so I want to ask you, Chris, about just your general observations when it comes to student support over time. How has it changed? How have things stayed the same? Especially because you've been in the music space for so long and also now are serving students yourself.
I would say I haven't noticed a great deal of change in the kind of support students need. It's always been quite a bit. The one thing that's changed in the past few years because of our curricular changes, and this is something I talk about in my book a lot, the idea that student support is not sufficient, right? And demographic diversity is not sufficient. Orchestras are not just difficult spaces for Black players because there are no other Black players. That's one reason, but it also has to do with the cultural values that inform how the orchestra functions. And in the same way, in the curriculum, in the con, the way that courses function and the kinds of content that are held up as being superior, right, devalues students' backgrounds. So actually changing what we do curricularly is really important and in fact essential if one is to help students of color actually feel at home in these spaces. I had a conversation with a Black student in my hip hop course last spring, toward the end of the course. And I had not talked with the student a ton. So, I approached him and I said, so how are you doing? How was your conservatory experience? And I had heard about a few things the student had been through already. But the student turned to me and said, yeah, having a pretty good time. And I said, excuse me? That's not what I usually hear from Black students in conservatory settings. That's not actually the most common response. And he said, "Oh yeah, I'm singing in a gospel choir, and I'm taking this. We have a djembe orchestra course. I'm taking this djembe orchestra course. I'm taking your hip hop course, and I'm taking African American music, and I'm having a great time." So that to me was that's a single anecdote, but it was validating of this idea that it's that the way in which the curriculum values or devalues certain cultural backgrounds, that plays a huge role in determining how comfortable people feel. But also the attitude of the professors. I would say I'm fairly casual for a musicology professor, and that has to do with certain kinds of strictures that I would identify in my own education as a musicologist as being particularly conservative and aligning with some conservative white American values in particular. At my first musicology course when I was in college, there were two Black music majors, including myself, when we started that course, and then there was one when we ended, which was me. But on our first day, we had a reading assignment, and we came in and there was a pop quiz. And the quiz involved questions such as, on page 25 of the textbook, in the upper left-hand corner, which composer is pictured? So everyone failed this quiz, and then we were told, this is the depth to which I expect you to memorize this textbook. You should read every word on every page, every session that we have, right? So my attitude is very much like, you got to be kidding me. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. Is that really what this is about, memorizing every word in this textbook? Because this textbook can't possibly be the only source of musicological knowledge. And indeed, certainly if you look at which Black composers were included in that edition, not very many. Not because they were not of quality, but of course because they had been historically erased, right, from that history. Not to mention the fact that the writing style was obtuse and uninteresting and dry and all sorts of things, right? So I basically discounted musicology as a subject after that, and came late to the class and sat in the back wearing a hoodie and didn't really care about that course, right? And I would never have imagined myself a musicologist. So that's certainly, like, I want to be as far from that as I possibly can, and be flexible and understanding about students' lives, and have a class that is alive and evolving and living and fun, in which we are engaged in as a community in making something happen. So we're all having a learning experience together. That idea of community is also in many ways antithetical to conservative white values, right? It's very rare that a classroom would function as anything resembling a community. But this idea, right, that it's not just who's in the room, it's how the class is structured, how it's taught, the attitude of the professor that reflects certain cultural values that will be alienating, especially to students from other backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. With that key focus on curriculum and how it's the key to make students feel belonging. I think about after graduation, and you talked about that a little bit, how, students who are having this holistic approach are finding success when it comes to competitions and things like that. But career-wise, like especially building a sustainable career, have you observed any shifts there when it comes to the career landscape as a whole?
I think it's becoming more discussed that it's been particularly difficult with all these diversity initiatives to get Black students into orchestras in particular. And I've also noticed such a wide range of Black artists who clearly have classical training, who are writing their own music and playing in hip hop groups and doing all kinds of things that are really like their own thing, right? And here's the intersection that people don't want to talk about, right? Because it has the potential to really upend what we do. The conservatory simultaneously, the training that we have now simultaneously is designed to stifle one's own personal creativity while also cutting people off from their own cultural values and backgrounds in general, right? That's true for everyone, not just students of color, particularly true for students of color, right? So finding ways to nurture diverse creative voices and individual voices is really paramount because we can see how the orchestra pipeline is just growing smaller and smaller, right? Those opportunities are ever more scarce. You must have the capacities of a world-class soloist from 30 years ago to even have a chance of winning a top orchestra job now, right? And those pipelines will only continue to become more elitist and difficult to access. So the idea of nurturing diverse creative voices and creating artists who can make their own careers would seem to be a promising avenue. But we don't really have faculty who tend to be trained to help students do that, right? So there are many ways in which that is disincentivized, right? The financial model we have does not exist yet for that. The model we have is for getting kids into orchestras and winning competitions. And no one has really quite figured out how to unlock the key to a new model. But it's got to be possible because there are so many interesting artists out there doing cool things, usually because they've jury rigged their training, like Solomon basically has done, right? He's done something that one is not supposed to do, quote unquote, and that we don't necessarily make it easy to do, even at Oberlin. So, the more I think that administrators can find ways to take those risks to build different models of training to produce creative artists who can access their own cultural values to make something new, that seems like the most American thing in the world to me.
Yeah, I agree. Solomon, were there any parts of Chris's book that especially resonated with you?
There was one moment in the book. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but there's one moment in Chris's book that really resonated with me. This is in the part of the first chapter, Assimilation and Conservatory Education. This is in the section where he's speaking on the traits of Black music. It says, the aesthetic preferences of social interaction, speech, dress, and sound production, given cultural priority, are unconsciously informed by a single set of psychological principles and assumptions about hierarchy, community, gender, and the dissemination of power. I think that is so powerful in the sense of narrative and in the sense of who we are. And so much of classical structure that you don't get to decide who you are. You don't get to decide what rep you play. When you're in an orchestra, you're a part of a bigger sound. It's always the soloist, the conductor, and the orchestra. You're not you. Essentially, you are the sound, and your narrative is not one that you're creating. And at the same time, you have African American music and small ensemble where you can have a voice and you can really speak your own melody, and especially when you have mentors and cultures that train you to do that. And Oberlin is really great for doing that, especially like what you were just saying, how when you take West African drumming, and when you open up your opportunities to certain things like that, you can really understand truly how to do that. And when you do that, and at the same time, if you immerse yourself in opportunities, it's like you can really learn how, I don't want to say how easy it is to perform music, but I guess how simple it is to perform music, because one could say that all music is either a song or a dance. And at the same time, all people can agree that music is transformative and limitless. And so much of classical training, in a way, takes you away from that. And I think the immersion of all these things that it says in here about community, gender, power, it really speaks to that. And of course, on top of many other things that are in this book. And I think that all of that is really important and powerful.
It means a lot to me, Solomon, because in writing this book, there were those certain moments where an idea came to me in a set of words like that. And I thought, this is really just how I want to put this. And maybe somebody is going to read it and it'll mean something to them. So it means a lot to me that it meant something to you.
Yeah, it really meant a lot to me. And of course, on top of many other things, but that particular moment really connected with me.
Cool. Thanks, man.
I love that so much. But yes, every page I read, I was like nodding. I was like, yep, that's right. if everyone did that, like what you were saying. So I love that you're, presenting at the conferences and hopefully inspiring other institutions to do this as well. So this is great work that you're doing, Chris. So I'm glad that we're able to shine a small light on it as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, that's a great way to wrap things up. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share before we go?
Make sure folks know that the book is available on Amazon, on Rutledge's website, and most of all, it's expensive. So I encourage people to ask their library to buy it. You don't have to buy it. That's cool. Just take it out. So there were two projects I wanted to mention just before we close. One is the conference that I run jointly with Phil Ewell called Theorizing African American Music. We ran the first iteration back in June of 22 at CIM and Case Western in Cleveland. And basically it's intended to offer alternative or new frames of analysis for African American music, in acknowledging that a lot of the frames we have are designed for music by white composers, Western composers, mostly German-speaking composers, and those frames are not really adequate to describe robustly what's happening in works by Black composers, classical and otherwise. And then also I have a group called Linking Legacies, which is a collective of African American classical musicians from Northeast Ohio, and we're playing works by composers also from here, because there are so many of them who are not really known well, and especially this area's history in the education of Black composers, and also how many Black composers were born and raised here. And it's not well known, but it's due to the fact that this area, places like Oberlin, Yellow Springs, were major stops on the Underground Railroad, and then Cleveland has always had a large Black population. So composers like Hale Smith went to CIM, Dolores White went to Oberlin and CIM, George Walker, Julia Perry was born and died in Akron. So that history is really important, and I want folks to know about that, and to consider coming to the TAM conference in this fall. It's going to be on November 8th, Wednesday, in Denver, at the University of Denver's College of Arts and Media. It's sort of like a pre-conference to the AMS SMT meeting that weekend.
All I wanted to say was that I really look forward to Equity Arc. I mean, when I did it beforehand and what's coming up next, all of the workshops on like writing for grants that's coming up, the next symposium that's coming up, I'm really looking forward to those. I learned so much at the most recent convention in Cincinnati. That was so amazing, and it's turning to be a really transformative organization that I'm a part of, and it's a privilege to be a part of it.
That's awesome. We're so glad that you're part of it as well. And yeah, definitely are excited for what's to come.
That concludes this episode. You can learn more about all our members and join the coalition at equityarc.org. Until next time, let's continue to make progress towards racial equity across the ARC.